With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Welcome in, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us on this Monday. Now, whether you're joining us on Twitter, Facebook, Twitch, Periscope, YouTube, however you're watching us, we certainly appreciate you being with us. We appreciate you making us a part of your day every single day. And I've got to say, this is one of those days that it feels like everybody's in a fog. I guess we're a little, overindulged on freedom over the long weekend, because since the 4th happened to fall on a Thursday, just about everybody got Friday off, including myself. And so because of that, you had essentially a 3-day work week, and it's really hard to get back in on Monday. But hopefully you had a productive day at work. I know that some of you may be at work, but most of you probably are off by now, and hopefully that was not too big of a shell shock for you. But the truth is, wasn't that much different in the news world. Because just looking at my stories and what I had to pull from today, not a lot of news going on. Kind of a slow news day. And that's to be expected. Everybody was busy celebrating the 243rd birthday of our country. And of course, we were no exception. We had our big 4th of July special that ran 90 minutes and had all the different Declaration of Independence themed content going on, which was really great. Hopefully you enjoyed that. If you haven't seen it yet, feel free to go on the YouTube channel or on our Facebook page and watch that. That's episode 100. But, most of us, we just are having a really hard time adjusting to that. And everybody kind of gets caught up in being with their family, which, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, but it also means that it's kind of a slow news day for that weekend. Everybody was not really paying attention to the news, and so not a whole lot going on. The only local story that I found that I think might intrigue some people, because I don't know that the story itself is that big a deal, but I think that there's some moral implications that we can bring on here, and I know that I'm going to try to do my best not to get overly preachy, although that is a occupational hazard with me. I am a minister, of course. But I do want you to think about this and just really consider the way that you would react to this in your personal life. The big local news here in the River region that I could find, the only thing that I could find that I really thought was worthy of reporting on, was that there is a Hooters that is coming to Prattville. So I guess in case you've been living under a rock and don't know, Hooters is what's referred to as a restaurant, and the women there are scantily clad and do so specifically because, men are there to see attractive women dressed a certain way, kind of dressed provocatively. Now, that doesn't mean that every single person that goes in there is specifically looking for that, or that is the motivation. But let's be honest, Hooters has even said and actually argued this in a court case I remember covering, that this is a part of their brand. This is a part of their selling point. The reason that they make money is because they have attractive young ladies dressed in, they're not, in their underwear or anything, but they're wearing clothes that don't leave a whole lot to the imagination. And this is not something that is completely new to the region. We have Twin Peaks here in Montgomery, and they actually sponsor Sports Radio 740, our sister station. And here's my take on that. And I'm just going to give you some of the details and then sort of my personal hot take on this. It's going to be next to Bass Pro. So in case you were wondering, that thing that they're building right next to the Bass Pro shop there in Prattville off of exit 179, that actually apparently is a Hooters. And so it finally leaked this week that they were able to confirm, yes, that is actually Hooters building a building over there. which really shouldn't be surprising to anybody because Hooters is a sports bar and it's going up right next to where that brand new Buffalo Wild Wings just went up. It's not far from Beef O'Brady's, and so similar styled restaurants are in the area, but Hooters is the only one that specifically makes it part of their marketing campaign for their waitresses to dress the way that they do. So I'm just going to give you some of my personal takeaways and then sort of give you the larger worldview sort of stance. I personally would not eat at a Hooters. And I'm a free market capitalist. They're not doing anything illegal. I don't think that they should be run out of town. I don't think that you should see people protesting with signs or torches or pitchforks and try to run them out of town or anything like that. It's a free country. And Hooters would not be building a location and investing this money in the Prattville community if they did not believe there was a market for their product. And are they right or not? I have no idea. I mean, for goodness sakes, a Hooters didn't work in Auburn. It's a college town, and they couldn't get a Hooters to stay in Auburn, that building there on South College. And it may just be South College, because South College is cursed. If you know anything about Auburn and the town of Auburn, pretty much everything on South College goes out of business within 2 years. In fact, that's a running joke in the city of Auburn. Enjoy your 2 years on South College. But regardless, I don't know if there's a market there, but Hooters would not be building there if they didn't think there was one. And I'm very much a free market guy. I don't like the fact that they're going to be there, but the truth is there's private citizens going there to eat and patron their business because they want to. And I would rather there just not be a market for that altogether, or for the marketplace to change nationwide and people to say, you know what, we're fine with you serving us food, but we'd really rather you not be dressed like that while you do it. I mean, to me, that would be the optimum situation, but it's not up to me. And as my buddy Andrew Wilkow would say, you can argue with popularity, but you'd be wrong. And so you can't argue against popularity, especially in a market. If they want to do that, if private citizens want to spend their own hard-earned money on that, and part of what you're paying for is the ambiance, and you know what I'm talking about, then I don't like it, but it's none of my business. And so if they want to go there and make a business and try to make money, that's up to them. I'm not going to patron it. I'm not going to go in there and spend my money on something like that because I know that at least part of my money is going to further that business that specifically lewdly dressed women is one of their selling points. And so I know that I'm going to alienate some people. I know there's probably going to be some people that are upset with me, but I'm going to explain sort of the larger picture here. Because I've had this question actually posed to me, honestly, not trying to play gotcha or do the other thing, trying to get me to explain to them why nobody should ever eat at Hooters ever. I've had young men come up to me and honestly ask, is it okay for a Christian to eat at a restaurant like that? To which the first big red flag would be, if you have to ask that question, then you probably already know your answer. Because it would be odd to ask the question, well, should a Christian eat at, I don't know, Wendy's? Well, can you come up with a reason why they shouldn't? And so with that, I think that already should at least send up a red flag, maybe not an automatic no, but certainly a warning that if you have to ask that question, think about why you have to ask that question. And that's really what I'm going to try to do here today. Should a Christian actually eat at Hooters? There's two principles that I want you to remember here. And then I'm going to go in a little bit more detail, so by all means, please stay with me on this and let me fully flesh out my thought before you immediately turn me off. I want you to remember that when you dedicate your life to Christ, you don't do it partially, and you don't take off time for it. And what I mean by that is, everything in your life, every part of your body, every action that you take is something that is supposed to be dedicated to Christ. Now, do people succeed in that? Absolutely not. We fail on that all the time. But there's a difference in failing to do so accidentally or failing to do so and then being repentant and knowing that you're doing something that is incorrect and continuing to do it anyway or trying to justify it. There is a difference there. And when it comes to a restaurant like that, I just want you to remember that your eyes belong to Christ, just like every other part of you. And whatever your eyes perceive you should at least be doing the best that you can to fill them with light. You remember the part of the Sermon on the Mount where Christ is saying that the eyes are the lamp of the body. And so whatever we see, whatever we fill our eyes with, and by extension our brain, because of course that's where that information goes, whatever we are filling our mind with, whatever images that we are filling our minds with are going to bubble to the surface, and they're going to be what our mind focuses on. And so, is it acceptable to knowingly put yourself in a position where you are going to be viewing something that is going to be tempting you? To intentionally make a conscious decision to go into an area where you know that there are going to be images there that encourage you to be tempted to something that you shouldn't do. I want you to think about that. Because when it comes to something like this, it's important for us to do the very best that we can to make sure that we are avoiding temptation. Now, maybe you're somebody that doesn't struggle with lust at all. Maybe you're somebody that can look at a picture of a woman wearing a Hooters tank top and tiny little booty shorts, and it doesn't make you lust after her at all. And I got to tell you, brother, if you can do that, more power to you, because you're stronger than me and most men. That thought never even enters your mind, that it never even goes to that place. If that's you, I commend you. And if that's you, I don't think that there would necessarily be anything wrong with you doing that, and it wouldn't put you in spiritual danger. But my question is, because I know that the vast majority of men out there are not like that, if that is something that you think even might present the possibility of you being tempted to have an immoral thought towards somebody that is not your spouse, then I think you really have to seriously consider whether or not that is something that is worth that. Because putting yourself in that situation in and of itself, knowing that temptation is going to be right around the corner, even if it doesn't lead to a later sin, you're certainly opening up the door for no reason. You're getting right up to that edge of the cliff and not falling off. And the question is, why would you do that? I mean, the book of James tells us that we are to flee from sin. In other words, not just, okay, we see it and we start walking in the other direction. You turn around and you start running in the other direction as fast as you possibly can. That's the imagery that is drummed up in the way the Bible sort of describes our struggle with sin. And one other thing I want you to think about as well. Yes, your body, your mind, your eyes all belong to Christ. And that's how it goes on the personal level. But I want to broaden it just a little bit. Your character and reputation also belong to Christ. Maybe you are one of these spiritual giants that I was just talking about, that can look at a woman dressed in that kind of attire, and your mind never even goes to that place. Maybe you are that spiritually strong. And like I said, if that's you, boy, I have nothing but respect for you, because I can't do that. And I'll admit that I can't do that. However, one thing that I want you to consider, one thing that I want you to think about here is, let's say that somebody else runs into you in that establishment. Somebody that knows that you're a Christian. Maybe even somebody that you've talked to about the scripture. Maybe even somebody that you're trying to convert, somebody that you're trying to teach about Christ and have them obey the gospel. What's that impression going to do? Now, maybe it does nothing. Or maybe, and again, I'm getting into a hypothetical here, understand that. But maybe the thing that goes through that person's mind is, wow, being a Christian is really easy. You don't really have to live any differently than anybody else. Or, I can be a Christian and still come to places like this. See, maybe you really are that immune to seeing images like that and having some kind of sinful thought enter your mind. But if that person's not, and he sees you as somebody who is spiritual, who is a Christian, and now he thinks that it's okay for Christians to do that, then you may be causing somebody else to sin. You may be becoming a stumbling block to another person, even if it's not causing you to sin in and of itself. And this is why it's important to remember that it's not just us that belongs to Christ, it's also our character and reputation. That even if it's not something that causes us problems personally, it may very well be something that causes other people problems, and that by itself is reason enough for us to avoid it. And I'm not just pulling this principle out of thin air. Actually, there is a passage that somewhat indirectly addresses this. And just so you understand, I'm going to give you a little bit of context before we go to it. It's in 1 Corinthians. And to understand what's going on here, Corinth was a very Greek town. You had some Jewish Christians that were living in Corinth as well, but primarily it was populated by Greeks, and most of the Christians that worshipped in Corinth were Greek Christians. They were not Jewish, they didn't know the old law beforehand, they did not know the law of Moses, and so they were coming out of a pagan society and moving directly into being a Christian, going from polytheistic to monotheistic. And sure, it was a massive culture shock and change to go from being a Jew to being a Christian, but not nearly as much as going from being a pagan to being a Christian. You see, the Jews at least had certain laws against immoral acts that carried over to Christianity. That wasn't necessarily true with a lot of pagans. I mean, you look back at pagan culture, there were an awful lot of things that were not only not considered wrong, they were actually considered worship to the pagan gods. Things like child sacrifice, sleeping with prostitutes, these things were actually considered religiously good things to do at the time that this was going on. And you had people in Corinth, the majority of Christians there, coming out of that culture and trying to live a God-centered life. It was very difficult for them. And I don't envy having that background and having to make such a massive life shift. But here's the thing to remember about that. One of the practices that they were talking about was meat that was sacrificed to idols, and this became a big fracas within the church. They had a problem with it, and especially the Jewish converts, the new Jewish Christians, were saying, you don't need to eat this meat that's been sacrificed to idols. And what was happening is there were certain meats that were sacrificed to idols that you could purchase, usually on the cheap, and you could eat it later, but there were people that were saying that this was something that was wrong and against God's will for a Christian to do. And Paul decides to set the record straight here, and the way that he sets it straight, I think, is significant and kind of applies to this same situation. So let's go ahead and look at 1 Corinthians 8, 7 through 13, where Paul writes, "However, not all men have this knowledge, but some, being accustomed to the idol until now, eat food as if it were sacrificed to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. But food will not commend us to God. We are neither the worse if we do not eat, nor the better if we do eat. But take care that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if someone sees you, who have knowledge, dining in an idol's temple, will not his conscience, if he is weak, be strengthened to eat things sacrificed to idols? For through your knowledge, he who is weak is ruined, the brother for whose sake Christ died. And so by sinning against the brethren and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause my brother to stumble." Now, there's a couple of really big, significant points that I want to bring out of that. First of all, we're going to kind of start at the end there. You'll notice that the conclusion that Paul draws here is, even though there's nothing in the world wrong with eating meat sacrificed to an idol because idols don't exist. They're not real, and nothing defiles the meat by it being sacrificed to an idol. And under the Christian system, as opposed to the Jewish system, there's no really such thing as defiled meat anyway. At least not from the spiritual sense. Obviously, meat could still spoil and that kind of thing and make you sick, but he's saying that there's nothing religiously wrong and there's nothing spiritually incorrect about partaking of meat that's sacrificed to idols because idols don't exist. They're not a thing. But he's also saying that if eating that meat, if eating that food causes my brother to stumble, even though I know there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, I will go the rest of my life without eating meat if that's what it takes. And I think that this is the brotherly love that Christ really wants us to aspire to. The kind of mentality that Paul has here. That, yes, I understand that it does not spiritually endanger me to do this, but it may weaken or be a stumbling block to another person, and if that is the case, then I will go to the extreme of never even eating meat at all, if that's what it takes to protect my brothers and sisters in Christ. And so I think that that's the principle that really applies here, maybe even more so than the point that I brought up earlier about lust. Because like I said, there are people that I think probably genuinely can go into a restaurant like that. They really do like the food or the hot wings or whatever it is, and it never even crosses their mind to have some kind of lustful thought about somebody there. Maybe that is true. But even if it is, do you really want other people to have them make it a stumbling block? And it is an ultimately unchristian attitude to have to say, well, that's their problem. That's not the attitude Paul had. Even though there was nothing wrong with eating meat that had been sacrificed to an idol, even though it wasn't defiled, they were able to buy it a little bit more cheaply, which is the reason that a lot of these early Christians that knew there was no such thing as idols were doing so. He's saying, look, if you have to go the extra mile, if this is causing problems in the church, if this is causing divisions, I understand that from a technical sense, you guys are right. But if somebody who doesn't know any better and assumes that you eating the meat of an idol means that, in this particular case, that there's no such thing that is, or there's nothing that's wrong with eating the meat of an idol, and maybe even believe that you believe in idols as well, then this is something that you're going to have to stop. It's not that the action itself is wrong. It's that you're showing a callousness towards the spiritual well-being of those around you. That's the problem. And so, like I said, even if you're somebody that really genuinely is just going there for the food and the part about the waitresses being dressed the way they are never even crosses your mind, it will cross the mind of somebody else. And I think that you're playing a very dangerous game with doing something that very well may violate the conscience of somebody else, or lead that person to believe that there is nothing wrong with it, even though they're not nearly spiritually as strong as you, and then winding up in a spiritually dangerous situation for them because they were following your example. And to that same analogy, I think that there are people that really have no weakness towards alcohol whatsoever. In fact, the reason that I use this analogy is because that's the boat that I'm in, honestly. I don't know why. I guess it's because I really hate the smell of it, but I have never even really been tempted by alcohol. It's not something that holds any kind of draw for me. I've been tempted by a lot of things, don't get me wrong, but alcohol just happens to not be one of them. It's not one of my areas of weakness. And so I have, in the past, walked into a bar, doesn't affect me. Not even tempted to drink any alcohol. But I would not bring somebody into a bar that was an alcoholic, because I know that the danger of that person falling off the wagon and being tempted by that And again, just to give a little disclaimer here, I'm not saying that consuming any alcohol is bad. I wanted to get that out of the way. I'm saying somebody that has an actual problem with alcohol abuse. I'm being very specific here. That would be incorrect. And there are certain bars, because of some of the other things that are going on around there, that I would not be caught dead in, if nothing else, just because I do not want other people to see me participating in some of the things that go on there. And if you've been in a college town, you know what I'm talking about. There are certain bars that are, pretty wild. And I wouldn't go into those places specifically because of what's going on there. But the principle here, I do believe, stands that you don't do things that are going to in any way endanger a brother and sister in Christ, and you do the best that you can to make an effort to be aware of those things and to avoid becoming a stumbling block to another person. And really, I think that this is the thought that should be constantly in our mind when looking at this issue from a spiritual standpoint. Could you see Christ going into a restaurant like this? Could you see, let's say that Christ was living in modern American times, that Christ and the apostles are heading down the road and they're just looking for a place to eat and they say, oh, there's a Hooters, let's head in there. I don't think so. Now, it's certainly true that he did dine with prostitutes, tax collectors, went into their home. But you'll notice he didn't go into any of the brothels or bathhouses. He didn't go into any of those places that specifically were there strictly for doing things that they should not be doing. And so I just can't see Jesus Christ and the apostles sitting down and having supper at a place like this. Now, talk to some people? Sure. Does that mean that anybody that's ever gone into a Hooters is going to hell? No, I don't think that at all. Again, I think that there's even scenarios where it wouldn't necessarily be spiritually dangerous, but I just want you to think about that. And really, the big takeaway from this should be that whatever we do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord. And when you get into an area where you're pretty certain that you fall into an area where your action is not doing that, there needs to be some correction and some self-evaluation there. And I think that going to a place like this would probably fall into that category. I know it certainly would for me. Again, I can't make a blanket statement here. There are other people that maybe it wouldn't necessarily do that. But I think for the vast, vast majority of men, that would fall under that umbrella. All right, so like I said, not a ton going on in the local news. So we're just going to go ahead and jump straight to national news. The Little Mermaid made a lot of news this weekend because they announced that Halle Bailey, not Halle Berry, two completely different people. Halle Berry is Storm from the original X-Men trilogy. Halle Bailey is going to be playing Ariel. So in the live-action remake, they are having a black actress that is going to play Ariel. And what's odd about this is I'm pretty sure that what happened in reaction to this is sort of a school-marming by the left for people on the right that were upset about this. But the problem is I had a really hard time finding anybody on the right that was actually upset, because I saw an awful lot of reaction to the outrage of this taking place, but I couldn't actually find anybody that was outraged. And so it was a bunch of people on the left, a bunch of social justice warriors getting up on their pulpit and dictating down to us why we're so stupid and ignorant and wrong and racist for being angry that a black actress is going to be playing The Little Mermaid. But I had a really hard time finding anybody that actually was mad about it. I found some people that said, I wish they had gone in a different direction. But I didn't find anybody that was upset that this was, that she was going to be playing The Little Mermaid. This seems to me, and I could be wrong, but it seems to me this is the same thing that happened when that video of AOC came out. You may remember a while back, several months ago, that there was a video of AOC that came out when she was, I guess she shot it when she was in college, and it's just her dancing around with a bunch of her friends. And the left came out and talked about how horrible it was and how it was sexist and racist. I don't know how it's sexist and racist, but how it was sexist and racist for the right to criticize her for doing that. But I really didn't know anybody on the right that had a problem with it. I couldn't find any prominent people on the right, not one, myself included. And I saw the video before I saw the reaction to it, that was upset about it. Not one person. And so this seems to be a very similar story to where there was to put it in economic terms, the supply of outrage did not meet the demand. So the left was full on expecting people on the right to be upset about this and to go into full on rage mode. And when nobody did, they just decided to talk about how silly it was for them to do so anyway. So in other words, they crafted the narrative before the story actually broke. That people on the left just decided, well, a bunch of those evil white conservatives would be very upset about this, and so we need to go ahead and react to it. But the thing is, there really wasn't anybody on the right that was upset to it, and so they were reacting to a story that never happened. Exactly like in the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez dancing video. Nobody was bothered by that. Not one. And so they really kind of manufactured this whole thing from beginning to end, even though there was really nobody that I saw, at least, that was actually upset about a black person playing The Little Mermaid. But I do want to bring a little bit of, because I do think there's some cultural significance underlying this. Two things can be true at once, and I want you to remember this. First of all, there's nothing inherently wrong with a black person playing a mermaid. Not at all. Don't have a problem with it. And so that's the first thing, because mermaid legends started in Syria. Not necessarily black people, but Arabic people. And those legends spread throughout the world. We think that Syria is the oldest. We're not 100% sure, but that's kind of where we believe it originated. And it was very prominent in Nordic culture. It was very prominent with the legends of Europe. We even see them spreading so far that there are some legends originating out of the East that seem similar to mermaids. And so mermaids don't quite have the coverage of dragons. Every culture has a dragon story. Every culture has a flood story. But not that many, not quite as many have them on mermaids, but it's close. I mean, you're talking about a range of legends that go all the way from the Middle East all the way up to Iceland, the Scandinavian countries, and then some parts of Asia. So they've got a pretty big spread. And I don't know if it's because the legends themselves moved or there were different accounts that just kind of got meshed together. That happens sometimes with myths and legends. And being somebody that, I wouldn't say I'm an aficionado on folklore, but I study it a little bit closer than most people probably do. I can tell you that there would have been a big variety on how mermaids looked. And you can even see that in pop culture. For example, if you've seen, Chamber of Secrets in Harry Potter, the mermaids in Harry Potter look like fish from head to toe. They have fish people, they're green, they have scales all the way top to bottom. And then mer people in Atlantis look almost entirely human. And what I'm talking about there is like the DC Comics version of Atlantis, or actually the Marvel version of Atlantis. Namor looks like a normal guy, more or less. And so does Aquaman. And so just like you can see in pop culture, there's a wide variety of what mer people look like. You see a similar thing in the legends. There's not a one set specific way that mer people are supposed to look. And so even more so than a lot of other legends, you could see how it wouldn't be that far-fetched to have a black person playing a fictional mythological creature like a mermaid. But nonetheless, even though that is true, it would be a lot different if the shoe were on the other foot. And what I mean by that is, it's not exactly the same as if they had a white girl playing Jasmine or Mulan, because those characters exist in a specific region and have a specific race, whereas a mermaid could be just about anybody. they're not specifically Aramaic or specifically black or specifically white or specifically Hispanic. That's just not the case with mermaids. They're fictitious characters, whereas Jasmine's supposed to exist somewhere in the Middle East, around 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. And the same with, even though, it's a white girl, Cinderella is somewhere in France around a certain time. Same thing with Belle. And so the different Disney characters, there are some that have a specific race because they existed at a specific time in a specific place. The Little Mermaid, not so much. The original animated story is supposed to take place somewhere in the Scandinavian countries, but it's not real specific, and it's not really all that important to the story that take place. It doesn't change the story in any significant way for her to be in a different location in the world. I mean, Atlantica, the fictional undersea kingdom that she's from, could be virtually anywhere. And so for that reason, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to get up in arms about the race of the character changing. That would be different with somebody like Mulan or Jasmine, who have a specific race. Or Pocahontas, for example. She's specifically Native American. It wouldn't make much sense to have an actor that isn't that race playing them. But you can bet your boots that if they did that if they changed the race of somebody like, what's her name? Tatiana, I guess, is the princess from The Princess and the Frog. She's not somebody that would necessarily have to be black. Her story takes place in Louisiana. And there's a pretty good diversity of people in Louisiana. So it wouldn't change the story at all for her to be a white person. But I guarantee you that if they changed it, the left would have lost their freaking minds. If they had taken somebody that in the animated version is black and in the live action version cast a white character to play her, boy, you would have seen the left come out knives and fangs first. That would have been all we were talking about for about 2 or 3 days. And maybe I'm projecting a little bit there, but I don't think I am. And I think pretty much everybody that's been watching this whole social justice warrior thing play out knows that they would have been up in arms and been furious if something like that had happened. And so that's the two things that can be true at the same time. One, that there's absolutely nothing wrong whatsoever with having a black person play Ariel in The Little Mermaid. But the second, if the shoe were on the other foot, yes, the left would have thrown an absolute hissy fit. And anybody with an ounce of common sense knows that. Look at how angry they got at Aladdin before anything had ever happened. I can't tell you the number of social justice warrior posts I saw on Twitter that were all upset and were predicting that Disney was going to whitewash Aladdin and they weren't going to have Middle Eastern actors playing him. It was fine. It was actually a pretty good movie. But here's another thing that can also be true. Not everyone that would prefer a traditional Ariel, somebody that looks more like the animated version, is a racist. And one way that I'll kind of prove that is, earlier this year, there were rumors that Queen Latifah was going to play Ursula. Now, it turns out those rumors are not true, and that there was not even talk of her playing Ursula, even though I think she actually would have been a good cast for it. But did you notice there was no outrage about that either? Why? In the cartoon version, Ursula is purple. She doesn't appear to have any clear race. Ariel pretty clearly has a race in the animated version. Doesn't mean that nobody that's a different race than her could play her in the live action. Just, I'm saying in the animated version, it's pretty clear that Ariel's a white girl. Not just a white girl, a white redheaded girl. The fairest skinned of all the people. And I know that because my sister is a redhead. She burns if she stands out in the sun for 20 minutes. But anyway, but when it comes to that, Ariel in the animated version is pretty clearly a white girl. Ursula has no clear race, and because of that, nobody batted an eye when the rumors were coming out that Queen Latifah was going to play Ursula because no one cared. It's not that they don't want black actors in this movie or think that black actors shouldn't be allowed. It's just that they would prefer a more traditional look for the character. And being somebody that is a fan of comic books, I understand this. For example, a lot of people, I even had people call in and tell me that I was a racist for being upset that there were certain Marvel characters when different Marvel movies were coming out that were a race different than they are in the comics. But here's the thing, it had nothing to do with the race itself. I just want the characters in the movies to look like their characters in the comics. Perfect example, Topher Grace. I was furious when I found out that Topher Grace was going to be playing Eddie Brock. Not because I don't like Topher Grace, not because I don't like white people, because Topher Grace is a shrimpy little stick man, and Eddie Brock is a huge, muscled up dude in the comics. In fact, even though I haven't seen the Venom movie yet, honestly, it doesn't really look like my kind of thing. I don't know whose bright idea it was to make a Venom movie without Spider-Man, but whatever, Sony. But Tom Hardy was a perfect cast for Venom. And so you see right there, it had nothing to do with race. It had a lot to do with whether or not the person actually looks like they're supposed to look from the comics. And considering that I really want a live-action movie version of the stories that are told in the comics as opposed to a reimagining of it, there are a lot of people that kind of see a similar light for the new Disney movies because these aren't just new movies telling the same stories, they're actual remakes of the old movie. There's a stylistic consistency between the two. Beauty and the Beast is basically just a carbon copy. I mean, it's just like they looked at that movie and said, all right, for the most part, there's a few exceptions here, but for the most part, how can we make this movie exactly the same in a live-action version? There was very little differentiation in that one, and that's fine. That's the route that Disney chose to go. And they did, in certain ways, a similar thing with Aladdin. They're doing a similar thing did a similar thing with Jungle Book. There were some slight changes, but basically they were trying to make carbon copies of the movie and make it a nostalgia trip that specifically points back to the art style of the original animated classic. And people were kind of expecting that with The Little Mermaid. It's pretty clear that that's not going to happen because they're taking the main character and making her look absolutely nothing like the original character. And to sort of prove my point here that it's not necessarily a race thing if you wanted a more traditional Ariel, I want you to think about this with Genie. Do you think people would have complained if in the new Aladdin they made Genie's skin green instead of blue? Of course there would have been. Why? Because Genie's skin is blue in the animated feature. That's not a race thing. There's not really blue people and green people. But they would want the character to reflect how they look in the original medium, in the original format. I don't remember anybody that had a problem with Will Smith playing the Genie. In fact, I said this after I came out of it, that was because they didn't try to do a carbon copy of Robin Williams and they tried to take the character in a different direction because nobody can replace Robin Williams. They probably did the smartest thing they could have done with doing a very different kind of Genie with Will Smith. But there was an artistic consistency between the old animated Aladdin and the new Aladdin by making Genie a giant blue-skinned magical creature. And people were kind of expecting the same thing with all these remakes, including The Little Mermaid. And so I understand people not necessarily being upset, but, a little disappointed that the live-action version isn't going to look exactly like the animated version. Just because somebody does think that does not necessarily make them a racist. In the same way that somebody that, if they had made Genie's skin green instead of blue, would have been a racist for believing that. It has a lot more to do with the artistic consistency than it does the race of the person actually playing it. And as somebody that is a huge comic book fan and has been disappointed by some of the comic book movies where the characters look very different, I totally understand that. In the same sense, I would be very upset if they had a white person playing Luke Cage or Black Panther or any other character that isn't white. Just going off the top of my head here, Robbie Robinson from the Spider-Man universe. That wouldn't have made a lot of sense. And so there is something to be said for the artistic consistency that they're striving for, and a fan that is a little disappointed that the movie's not going to look exactly like the animated feature. that's understandable, and that does not necessarily make that person a racist. All right, so what we're going to go ahead and do here is we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back in just a second.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going out!
Hey everybody, it's Caleb here, and I was just driving through South Alabama. I had a couple quick thoughts that I'd like to share with you. First of all, I really love it when the environmentalists tell us that there just are not enough trees, that we're killing all the trees, that there are no trees out there. As you can probably see through the window there, South Alabama is just trees. There's virtually nothing. You got maybe Andalusia, Enterprise, and Dothan, and trees, and that's pretty much it, other than Gulf Shores, which is the beach. So I genuinely believe that it should be part of our criminal justice system that any liberal that whines too much about there not being enough trees, that their sentence, their punishment for that, should be to drive through South Alabama, because they will be immediately disillusioned about this idea that there are just not enough trees left in the world. There is nothing but trees for miles and miles and miles and miles. Another thing that I wanted to bring up, and it actually made me hearken back to a comment that was made, I would say a few months ago, by Hillary Clinton, talking about how the coast, in other words, the people in California and Oregon and Washington and then New England, that they all voted for her and everybody else voted for Trump, which, you know, is true. And then she also talks about trying to essentially explain why that is. She says that, well, all the dynamic people, all the movers and shakers and the people that are making money, those are the ones that voted for me. It was the neophytes, the little people over in flyover country that voted for Trump. And goodness knows that I'm not the world's biggest Trump supporter. I didn't even vote for the guy in the first election, but one of the reasons that she lost that election in the first place, and one of the reasons that Americans in general are just so tired of that, is because there is a large contingency of the left that genuinely believes that only people in the cities are the ones that are dynamic and important. And I'm driving through South Alabama, and right now it's mostly just trees, but especially when you get a little bit further north. I was driving through here and I noticed there's so many fields with cattle and hay, and you get a little bit further south and you're going to see an awful lot of cotton and peanuts and some soybeans. And so I really do think, and I think that this is important to remember, that though there are people in the cities that tend to vote Democrat and have never seen a farm, have never been through, quote unquote, the flyover country, I think it's incredibly important for us to remember that, yeah, they may look their nose down at people like that, but if you were to actually take one of those people and have them try to survive in an environment where there were not the people producing their food and their fiber in states like Alabama, that those cities would immediately devolve into chaos and die. And I think it's so hilarious that the people in cities look down their nose at people in the country, people in farmland, that kind of thing, and then they wouldn't even be able to begin to have a similar lifestyle that they do if it were not for those people. And maybe I'm thinking about this because I'm an ag major and state convention for the Alabama FFA is coming up. But what it really all boils down to is that whether they appreciate it or not, whether or not they understand the relationship between their life and what they're doing and people in places like this that provide the lumber for the house that they live in or the building that they work in, and provide the cotton for their clothes and provide the food that goes on their table, they would quickly learn an appreciation once that stuff went away. Once they realized that the magic bread fairy doesn't just bring bread to the supermarket, that there are people involved in the growth and production and transportation of that, I think it would really paint it in a different light. And what I mean by that is, I don't think that it's productive for us to go out and talk about how silly and stupid they are and how ridiculous their position is on that, even though there's some truth to it. I think we do better catching more flies with honey than vinegar, and explain to them and talk to them and educate them about the important role of Middle America to the rest of the world, to the rest of the economy. Because the reason that we are an economic powerhouse, the reason that we have so many people that don't have to be involved directly in growing their own food and wondering where their food's going to come from one day to the next, the best way to do that is through education and helping them to understand that that is an important part of it. So let's just try to come at it from a diplomatic perspective, and hopefully they'll be able to realize at that point that it's important for them to appreciate the American farm.
Hey everybody, and welcome back. Thank you for sticking with us through the break. So one thing that I did want to do, even though we're not going to spend a ton of time on this story, is I want to give props to Starbucks. Now, Starbucks is not typically a company I frequent. In fact, I don't really like coffee. I have never liked coffee my entire life. And because of that, at no point in at any time in my life have I ever purchased coffee from Starbucks. I think I have gotten a hot chocolate there once when it was really cold in Indianapolis, and I may have bought coffee for someone else there once. My memory's a little fuzzy on that. It was a long time ago. I think I bought a coffee for my sister there once. But I'm not exactly a Starbucks fan. But nonetheless, when they do the right thing, I want to give them props for it. So to understand where this is all coming from, it started when a specific Starbucks made a really big mistake in Phoenix, Arizona. So on the 4th of July, no less, and some of these cops, keep in mind, were actually veterans. There were 6 police officers, and the manager of the Starbucks approaches their table and tells them, y'all are going to have to leave. And the rationale for that is they were 6 uniformed police officers, and a customer complained to the manager that they were making them feel unsafe. Now, I have no idea who this person is or what their motivation was, but I got to tell you, if they had walked into my store and I were running a restaurant and they said, yeah, could you do something about those police officers over there? They're making me feel unsafe. I'd say, you're going to have to get over that. I'm not kicking out paying customers because you feel uncomfortable. Not really my business. And so when it comes to that, that was really absurd. I don't know what the rationale coming from the Starbucks manager was on that, and it is especially troubling considering that some of these police officers were actually veterans and this was taking place on Independence Day. But nonetheless, this is what happened, and I actually made a joke that they probably went to Dunkin' and had a much better time, because you would go to Starbucks when you've got Dunkin'. And yes, I'm saying that mostly because I don't care for coffee. I'd rather have donuts, and that's why I would prefer Dunkin' anytime. But I know a lot of people like their coffee too. Anyway, so that's really where we stood on that, and there were a lot of people online trying to compare this to the loitering black guys at the Starbucks in Philly. There's a number of reasons that there's no comparison there. First of all, they were not kicked out for making people feel unsafe. They were kicked out for repeatedly being told, guys, you have to buy something or you need to leave, which, by the way, at the time was Starbucks corporate policy. And then using the bathroom, even though the manager told them they couldn't do that until they made a purchase. And so they broke the rules on multiple occasions, and we found out later that these guys had a history of doing stuff like this, and the manager there at Starbucks actually knew this, and we confirmed it from the security footage. There's really no comparison here. The police officers were paying customers, not breaking any rules, that were kicked out because the manager heard a complaint from another customer saying that they felt unsafe because of police officers, which is absurd on a number of levels. If anything, I feel far safer whenever there's a police officer in a place that I'm eating at or a business that I'm in. But whether or not they should feel safe or unsafe, absurd as it may be, isn't really the issue. The issue is that the Starbucks manager, even though they had the right to do so, was kicking people out of their place of business for this reason. In Philadelphia, completely different situation. The people there are breaking the rules. They're the ones that are the problem. They're the ones that are not complying with Starbucks corporate policy, that are causing issues, and then were asked to leave, and then the police officers showed up, and after a long period of time, about 10 to 20 minutes if memory serves, of waiting and not buying anything, then they were escorted out. So completely different scenarios. There's not even a realm of cognitive thought where anything coherent comes out of making that comparison. But nonetheless, that's what happened. And I wanted to just give them props here because Starbucks actually did do the right thing here. This is a tweet from them. On behalf of Starbucks, I want to sincerely apologize to you all for the experience that 6 of your officers had in our store on July 4th. Read more Starbucks, and so it just it credits the story, gives the link, and then says who's talking. It's the executive vice president of U.S. retail. So here's the thing: a lot of people, I think, are probably going to let their emotions get the better of them and still be upset at Starbucks. I say that you got to give people credit when they do the right thing. This was one isolated incident from one manager at one Starbucks. And just like I said when it was the other story that we were just talking about that people tried to compare it to, even if it had been racism, which is absurd, and we know that now because we have the facts of the story, even if it had been racism back in Philly that was motivating that, that's still one incident at one store. And so this is not indicative of the corporate policy as a whole. Now, does this mean that I'm a fan of Starbucks? Absolutely not. But I'm trying to call balls and strikes here. Starbucks is an incredibly liberal company. It's a company that doesn't even make products that I like, and they give money to Planned Parenthood. So they check pretty much every box on the list of reasons Caleb Colquitt would not like a company. But I still believe in sticking up for people when they're right. And on this case, they did the right thing. They apologized, and all of this mess hopefully will go away now. So I think it's important that when our political enemies do something that is correct, that we praise them for it, because if not, then what motive do they have in the future for doing the right thing, even when it may not necessarily be something that their political opponents are going to find popular? And so I think that it's important to just stand up for people when they do the right thing. So let's go ahead and go to the Daily Dose of Stupid.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
All right, today's Daily Dose of Stupid comes via the mainstream media, namely CBS, NBC, and ABC. So this is in the wake of course, you remember that we did the big 4th of July special. That was the last time we actually did a show. Well, it turns out that Trump had his big Salute to America parade, and the mainstream networks decided that they were going to nix it, that they were not going to cover it. Now, I personally don't even like the idea of the military parade. I was against it from the onset. You remember that I was very critical of it when Donald Trump was sort of batting the idea around, and that's specifically because Donald Trump himself, not the mainstream media, not some third party that's speculating on this, Donald Trump himself said that essentially he got the idea from two places: Bastille Day in France and North Korea. North Korea is constantly having these military parades where they're showing off their military hardware. Bastille Day in France, they do the same thing. And the source of those two ideas, a dictatorship and a monarchy. And I just don't think there's a whole lot patriotic about taking ideas from dictatorships and monarchs. And also there's sort of the principle that the sly eagle hides his claws. I don't like the big showy display of force that is trying to be trotted out here. Everybody knows that the American military is the most powerful force on Earth. There's no question about that. Nobody that seriously looks at any of this stuff doubts that. And because of that, there's no reason to show off. If you're the biggest, toughest guy on the football team, for example, you don't have to tell everybody that. They'll look at your stats and they'll figure it out. Same thing with baseball, same thing with really anything that's competitive. And so I don't like the idea that we go around and show off. It's the same principle that I have as a concealed carry person. I carry a firearm with me pretty much everywhere I go. There's very few places where I don't have a gun on me, and if I do, it's probably because of some kind of security thing. For example, back when I was taking chemotherapy, I didn't take a gun with me there. Partly because it was harder to sleep with a gun on my side, and also partly because they have armed security there, and there's a good reason why they don't allow guns in hospitals. And they provide security for everybody there. Would I have liked to be able to take it? Maybe. But the point is, there are a handful of locations I don't carry. And I say that just to instill this idea that I carry pretty much anywhere I go. The worst kind of carrier is somebody that is constantly talking about it or pulling it out of their holster or anything like that. I've seen people do that. I've seen people walk around with long rifles strapped to their back. I've seen people walk around with their firearms at either ready or near to ready. And you're just being an arrogant jerk if you do that. The best way to wear power is to wear it lightly. And I genuinely believe that. And that's one of the reasons, there's other reasons too, but it's one of the reasons that I concealed carry. I can use my firearm if I have to. I pray to God I never have to. But if I'm ever put in a situation where I have to use my firearm, I can. But I don't have to show it to everybody. I don't have to brag to everybody that I can do this if I need to. And that's really the main problem that I had with the whole Bastille Day style show of force with the military, parading everything around, showing off how big our military is and how powerful our military is. That's something Kim Jong-un has to do because he barely has a military. That's something France does to prove that they actually have a military, because if they didn't, I think most of their citizens wouldn't think that there really was a military in France. So there's also that. There's no reason for the United States to do this. It was a massive waste of $60 million in taxpayer money. There was absolutely no reason for that to take place. 4th of July festivities? Sure. But that's not even the stupid thing, because I disagree with it. I would rather we didn't do it. But the really stupid thing came from NBC, ABC, and CBS. They decided not to air it. They decided, nope, we're not going to air the parade. Look, especially when you're dealing with the average American citizen, when you're not dealing with one person specifically, when you're dealing with a massive group, the dumbest thing that you can do, the best publicity that you can give any kind of event, is to tell people they're not allowed to watch it, is to try to hide the ball from them. I'm guessing, and I could be wrong, I'm guessing there was no better way to promote people watching the president's event than the three major networks telling people that they were not going to cover it and they're going to have, Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy on in the place of the big 4th of July event in Washington. Nothing made people want to watch it more than pulling it from the airwaves. I'm guessing a lot of people, probably big Donald Trump supporters, would have not even known that it was going on. They would have been too busy grilling out with their family or going to other events that probably made it a point after hearing that to stay home specifically to watch that event. The dumbest thing that they could have done to try to prevent people from watching it is to say that they weren't covering it. If they had covered it just like any other big event coming from the President of the United States, I guarantee you their ratings would have been lower. They actually, granted, this is just speculation, but I'm guessing that they probably helped the ratings more than anything else they could have done by not showing it on their networks. And so that was truly the stupidest thing that was going on. And another thing, too, that was really stupid was their rationale for it. They said that the reason that they were not going to carry Donald Trump's Salute to America was because he was politicizing the 4th of July for his own ends. The problem with that is I'm more than 2 years old. And that means that I can remember President Obama's speeches happening on the 4th of July. I can remember him calling for DACA to be put into place. I can remember him talking about how great it is that on the day that we're celebrating our independence, that people are independent from not having health care anymore, pushing Obamacare on the 4th of July. This was not an uncommon practice by the Obama administration. I don't remember if they did it every single year, but the president made a 4th of July address most years. And I don't ever remember one that was free of politics. He was always pushing something in his agenda on the 4th of July. And yet I don't remember any of these networks not carrying that because Obama was politicizing Independence Day. I don't think that you'll ever find an article on MSNBC or NBC News or ABC News or CBS News that criticize President Obama for pushing politics on the 4th of July. I just don't think that you're going to see that. By all means, fact check me. If I'm wrong, show it to me, but I do not remember those stories taking place, and I couldn't find them when I did a search before this story either. So maybe those stories are out there, but I couldn't find them. And by the way, if you do find them, and if you are a better researcher than me, we have a position open for you here at Tactics Radio. But nonetheless, I think that what's more important is the principle underlying this, because patriotism is not about showing off your strength. It's not even about showing off the flag or anything else. Real patriotism is loyalty to the ideas that America was founded on. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and that God gives us certain rights that cannot be taken away by anybody, and that it is the sole purpose of government to preserve and protect these rights. That's the American idea. The idea that man can rule himself and does not need a government to tell him what to do. That he can serve his God and live a righteous, morally correct life and doesn't need the government to tell him how to do that. That we all live like free men. That we don't necessarily always agree with one another, but we respect one another's liberty. And we will fight to the death to preserve it for other people. That's the American ideal. That's what a real patriot does. And so, wearing the flag or having a big military parade, I'm not saying that those things are effectively unpatriotic. I'm not saying that there's anything inherently wrong with those things in and of themselves. And I'm not saying that just because a guy happens to have a giant flag in his yard that means he's not really patriotic. I'm saying that there can be sort of a false patriotism going on there. It's kind of like Auburn. For those of you who may not know, Auburn is it's where I went to school. You can be kind of a bandwagon Auburn fan. Now, there's not nearly as many of them as there are Alabama fans, and I know that half my audience just cut me off. But you can be a bandwagon fan of any team. Every team has them. Every team has, some kind of bandwagon fan base. But nonetheless, regardless of that, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit distracted. Something's going on here. But anyway, real patriotism is the loyalty to the idea itself, not necessarily having a really big flag or wearing a flag shirt or an Uncle Sam hat on the 4th of July. Now, are those things that a true patriot could do? Certainly, just like a real Auburn or Alabama fan can wear all the gear. But that's not what makes them a real Auburn or Alabama fan. That's all just window dressing. And so I think that we need to be far more concerned with having real patriotism and understanding the principles that America was founded on and following those. We'll be back with the Chaplain's Report in just a second.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Community Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. Now it's time for a reading from the SJW Bible. Today's reading will come from Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans, and after putting the fire in them, placed incense on it and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And the fire came out of the presence of the Lord, which created a wicked cool light show for them to see, and totally got everyone feeling the Spirit's presence. Then Moses said to Aaron, "It is what the Lord spoke, saying, even though I didn't command you to use this strange fire, I totally understand your need to express yourselves in worship and keep yourselves entertained." So Aaron therefore danced and yelled with joy, knowing that his sons were having a good time at worship. Moses called out to Mishael and Ezaphan, and the son of Aaron's uncle Uzziel, and said to them, "Come forward, carry your relatives away in front of the sanctuary outside of the camp, for they have fainted from being overwhelmed by the power of God's coolness." So they came forward and carried them still in their tunics outside the camp, as Moses had said. Then Moses said to Aaron and his sons Eleazar and Ithamar, "Do not uncover your heads, nor tear your clothes, because God wants us to always be happy, and as long as we're happy, He's happy. Therefore, if worship doesn't give you an overwhelming sense of euphoria, you need to find another congregation, preferably one with a more dynamic pastor and band." So they did according to the word of Moses. And the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, "Do not drink wine or strong drink, neither you nor your sons with you, when you come into the sanctuary, so that you will be able to drink more once you arrive. It is a perpetual statute throughout your generations. And so as to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, between the unclean and the clean, because when worship stops being fun or feels judgy, then it becomes profane and unclean." Wow, so inspiring. This has been a reading from the SJW Bible, and remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's Report today, we are continuing our series in the book of Daniel, and just to give you a little bit of background on this particular passage. When Daniel is saying this, Gabriel has come down and explained to him the visions that he's seeing and given him a sort of a layman's version of all the visions that he has seen beforehand, and gives him a prophecy of what is to happen. And so we're going to delve into Daniel chapter 9, verses 25 through 26, where Gabriel gives an explanation of this. And here he says, "However, not all men have this knowledge." Oh, wait, sorry, that's the verse from earlier. That was weird. Okay, sorry, Daniel 9, 25 through 26. "So you are to know and discern that from issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again, with plaza and moat, even in the times of distress. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the Prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be a war. Desolations are determined." So, in this particular prophecy, it seems as though what is being talked about, and it's pretty clear because Gabriel comes out and uses the phrase Messiah, the anointed one, in other words, referring to God's chosen son, Jesus, that he's giving a prophecy of this. And what's so amazing about this is you have to remember, this is during the captivity of Babylon. And without going into too much detail on the timeline, this was back when Daniel was writing this. This was before the temple was even founded. And what is he saying in this verse? That when the temple is reconstructed, because you remember that the temple has already been destroyed, the one that Solomon built, that one was destroyed when Judea was taken over. So Jerusalem is going to have a new temple erected. Gabriel is predicting this. And when the new temple is erected, that is the one that the Messiah is going to enter. And if you know your history, the new temple was eventually reconstructed, actually reconstructed in a relatively short amount of time. And that new temple, though not as grand as the one that Solomon built, was the temple that Jesus worshiped at. That Jesus Christ, when he came to this earth and God in human flesh in that form, he went to that temple in Jerusalem. And so you're seeing the aspects of this property come true, and that the Messiah is going to be there, and that he is going to come in that when the temple is restored. So the temple is built, you've got a few hundred years pass, and then the Messiah is born, the Messiah comes into the temple. And what's interesting to note too is that after the Messiah has entered the temple, the prediction is that the temple is going to be destroyed. And if you, again, know your secular history, what happens in 70 AD, approximately 40 years after Christ has already ascended into heaven? Rome comes in and destroys the new temple. And so the temple serves its purpose. And here we see hundreds of years before the birth of before the birth of Christ, and even before the new temple is restored and is reconstructed in Jerusalem, Gabriel is already informing Daniel the new temple is going to be built, and that is going to be the temple that the Messiah comes to. And after the Messiah leaves, that's when the temple is going to be destroyed. The history lines up with what Gabriel has said. And I think that it's important to note that we can kind of draw a parallel here between the temple and the Old Testament. Both, in a sense, are something that were there and served a purpose for a time. We see this repeated over and over again in the book of Hebrews, that the old things are a shadow of what is to come. And so it's true that God had a special relationship with Israel for a long time, and it served its purpose. In the same sense, God had an original temple, and it served its purpose. And it was destroyed, and then Israel resurrected it. It created a new temple, and it served its purpose too. See, all these things that happen in history, in our finite human mindset, especially one that only focuses on the physical realm, we would almost look back at that and say, well, what was the point of building it in the first place if it was just going to be destroyed by Rome later? It was to fulfill this prophecy, and so there was a temple for Christ to go to in Jerusalem for all the prophecies to be fulfilled. Christ entered into the city. He entered into this temple multiple times. As a young Jewish man, he would have gone to the temple probably every Passover, at least based on the scripture that we have. And so this temple served its purpose, just like the nation of Israel served its purpose. And then we know later on, it stopped serving its purpose. The whole point of the entirety of the Old Testament and the entirety of the temple and the sacrifices and everything else was to prepare this earth for the coming of the Christ. That's what the whole thing was about. In fact, there's a really great quote by C.S. Lewis where he talks about the Bible reads as though it is one continuous narrative. And it is. But it's written in different styles by different authors over a vast amount of time. And yet, the story of Christ brings everything together. It makes everything in the Old Testament make sense. It's not as though it was an addendum that was tacked on to the end of it. It's more like it was the chapter that was always intended to be written to make everything else that happened earlier in the book make sense. And that's what's really so fascinating about it, and to me is one of the greatest proofs of the divinity of Scripture. That no one single human, and I say this as a novelist myself, could have crafted a story that made that much sense. Much less 40 different authors over more than 1,000 years who didn't know each other, who could not have possibly predicted all of this. And it all comes together in one coherent narrative. And Daniel plays a part in that. Daniel's prophecy here lets us know, hey, the Messiah is coming. The temple is going to be rebuilt. It's going to be established. He's going to go there. He's going to worship. And then when he's gone, it will have served its purpose. And just like everything else in the old law, it will be swept away. Because now we're all heirs of Abraham. We all have that connection to God and his covenant. And all those that are washed in his son's blood can share in the rewards and the privileges of being a child of God, just like the Israelites could in old times. The whole purpose of having that story, of having that relationship with God, was to make the world ready for the coming Christ, whose blood would be given up as an offering for all people of this earth to come into a right relationship with their Creator. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.